Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I thank the witnesses for their testimony today. Mr. Johnson, in your testimony, you stated, quote, that a functioning society requires that reasonable officers be provided disqualified immunity in applicable civil cases. Without it, the orderly administration of justice would come to a halt amidst paralyzing fear of personal liability. Am I right?
Yes, sir. That's in my testimony, Representative Johnson.
And now you heard Judge Newman, who testified that, and by the way, Judge Newman spent 42 years on the U.S. Court of Appeals, and as a federal district court judge, he presided at the trial of more than 30 police misconduct cases. And you recall he testified that contracts between cities and police unions provide that the city indemnify police officers found liable in lawsuits under Section 1983. And Judge Newman also testified that it was his experience that jurors in police misconduct cases don't know that the municipality would pay the judgment against the police officer, and they would frequently find the officer not liable just to avoid what they thought would be the imposition of liability on the officer. In other words, the officer would have to pay the judgment themselves. Mr. Johnson, you don't disagree with Judge Newman on that point, do you?
No, Representative Johnson, I certainly don't disagree with his observations as a sitting judge and an appellate judge.
Let me ask you this.
My experience comes from a different part of the criminal justice system, though.
Well, we're not talking about criminal justice system. We're talking about our civil justice system and its ability to do justice by way of persons who would be aggrieved by police misconduct. And I know, Mr. Johnson, that you would agree that there are some instances of police misconduct, unnecessary use of force, those kinds of things do happen. Isn't that correct?
Of course they do, sir. Yes, sir.
Yeah. And Judge Newman recommends that Congress create a law that mandates that the city would be liable to pay any judgment rendered against a police officer for misconduct, and that qualified immunity could remain a defense available to the police officer. Mr. Johnson, what is wrong with Judge Newman's proposed solution?
Representative Johnson, I would direct the subcommittee to the submitted written testimony of the National Sheriff's Association, for example, for the concerns that employers have regarding that. I think that
well, I mean, we're talking about putting it on the employer to have to pay any judgment rendered against their employee. What about that solution do you disagree with?
I guess and I don't want to step out of my lane talking for the sheriffs and the chiefs, but
I mean,
since you asked,
this doesn't really require much analysis. It's a very common sense solution to a real problem. Citizens have been stopped from holding rogue police officers accountable when they commit misconduct, and the denial of justice in those kinds of circumstances due to this doctrine of qualified immunity is an injustice. And we're just simply talking about how to render an injustice something that does not continually happen in these cases in America. So what criticism would you have on Congress passing a law that imposed liability on governments for the actions of their employees?
Thank you, Representative Johnson. I understand the argument. I guess my concern on that would be that when we're talking about liability itself, whether it's on the individual officer or on the employing agency, our view of qualified immunity in general in this context whether it's for the officer or the employing agency, is that in fairness and in justice, it ought not be imposed if we're talking about a liability predicated upon the violation of a constitutional right when that right was not yet known at the
Well,
time.
yeah,
that the
well, I
executive-
mean, you could still have the doctrine of qualified immunity in place, but you would simply have a situation where juries would know that if they found a police officer liable, then that police officer would not be personally liable. It would be the city that would pay the judgment. What's wrong with that?
If you can quickly
I
respond, we're over time, but if you quickly respond to I'd appreciate it.
Yes, Chairman. I think the problem with that writ large is that the same reason that we don't allow jurors to know, hey, if this person's liable, someone else is going to pay the bill, because it tends to engender greater verdicts and that we would otherwise have based simply on the evidence.
You just simply don't want to have police
Time's
officers held
up.
liable, period.
I've got to call
With that, I
time.
yield back, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Johnson.